So this is well enough thought through that it took a little bit more time to prepare my response to it than Vosh, because Vosh is a fool. And so I just want to let him speak for a little bit before I start to respond.
Thoughtslime is wrong when he claims that anarcho-capitalism is not a form of anarchy, and I'll show that this is true even within his own flawed definitions. I will then show why those definitions are terrible. Thoughtslime has a few contradictory definitions of anarchism, but the general thrust of his concept is that anarchy has no rulers. This definition of anarchism includes anarcho-capitalism, and AnCaps do not disagree with a single modicum of this. But what about wage labour? Wage labour is not a scenario where one party rules another. A ruler is a person who imposes rules on someone, not one who works out a mutually beneficial and voluntary interaction with a person. And yes, every single voluntary trade is mutually beneficial, otherwise it would not occur as the losing party wouldn't consent. Ultimately, this comes down to a drastic misunderstanding of what anarcho-capitalism is. Rothbard coined the phrase to distinguish himself from the founder of anarchy, Proudhon, in that Rothbard was an Austrian economist and Proudhon was not. This is literally the only difference, what economic theory we hold. We do not detract ethically from Proudhon's anarchism in any way, shape or form. But Proudhon said property is theft. To cite this is to either be married to the concept that AnCaps aren't anarchists, so much so that you discount the context, or to not have bothered to read the context. Proudhon was a Frenchman at a time when much of the land in Europe was under the possession of the aristocracy, who had not traded or homesteaded the property, but conquered it from peasants. This property certainly was theft. Proudhon makes this distinction explicit when replying to the French economist Jérôme Adolphe Blanqui's criticism of his property is theft concept. Monsieur Blanqui recognises that there are massive abuses, odious abuses in property. For myself, I call property exclusively the sum of those abuses. And again in 1841, distinguishing his beliefs from those of Pierre Leroux. Thus, according to Monsieur Leroux, there is property and property, the one good, the other bad.
Okay, so I think this is enough to be working on. Let's just break down what he's just said. So I took some notes. So the first thing that he said is that anarchism, I have to make that even smaller because you can't see my face. My face is beautiful and you have to see my face. Look at my face, it's so pretty. Okay, so he said that anarchism is without rulers. To that I agree. That is certainly the basic sort of definition of anarchism. It's a little bit more complicated than, of course, but I think that it's a reasonable place to start. And so then he talked about wage labor, and I agree that the idea of having wage labor as a general principle is not in and of itself anti-anarchistic, right? It's not definitionally authoritarian to have someone who you choose to work for be able to provide you work. I agree so far. His second thing is that he says that all trades are mutually beneficial, or else the loser wouldn't consent. Well, that's not entirely true. Right? There are cases where people don't have an option or of whether or not they're going to consent. So an example would be, as Proudhon himself suggested, this is why Proudhon thought that property was theft, the case of feudal Europe, right? So the example here is the idea of, if you are in feudal Europe, right, there is a lord who controls all of the land. Because that lord controls all of the land, you don't have an ability to consent or to voluntarily trade your labor for the right to live on that land with someone else. You don't have the chance to do that with anyone at all, right? You have to pay to live on land, right? You have to do that. There's no option. You are going to live on land, and therefore, because you are going to live on land, you are going to pay the person who owns the land. Well, the question, though, is like, why is that different when all of a sudden there are more lords, right? If, let's say, instead of being a vassal, a serf rather, of a single lord, the single lord is the only one who's able to be the one who you're going to pay to live, right? So you're going to give 90% of your income in terms of you as a feudal serf, as a subsistence farmer. You're going to give 90% of the food that you're able to produce to this lord, and he's going to go sell it off, and he's going to be the one who makes all this bountiful profit, and blah 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 blah. He's going to take that, and that's obviously feudalism. That's obviously wrong. We all agree that that's wrong. Why is it that if there's two, that suddenly it stops being wrong? Why is it if there's three that it suddenly becomes acceptable? This distinction that Proudhon himself was trying to describe when he was writing to Blanqui was the distinction. I misspelled distinction, and I don't really care enough to fix it, but I kind of do. Wait, how do I spell distinction? Sometimes distinction. Wait, no, it was right. Whatever. He's describing a distinction between property, the product of natural resources, and a possession, or a product of labor, the trade of labor, right? So when you think about a possession is something that you can just like create, right? And everything, to be clear, everything is a product. Every single possession you might have is a product of two things. It's a product of labor. Someone put in effort to create the thing that you have, and it's also a product of natural resources. Well, the context of the labor, right? There's an infinite amount of labor. Anyone can put in as much labor as they possibly want to do in order to do any sort of thing that they might want to do. And so it's totally valid to get completely the full value of your labor. And that is my belief. That's why I'm an anarchist. That's why I believe that it's good to do things like that. But it's also, I think this is why it's crucial to be a Georgist, not just to be an anarchist, but to be a Georgist specifically. And I think that there are examples of people who are anarchists, genuine anarchists, but are on the left who don't fully engage with Georgism as I wish they would. I don't count supposed anarcho-capitalists as being anarchists, though, because they don't recognize this fundamental framework, this fundamental truth that if you control all of the natural resources, that is not a free society. If you control all of the natural resources, you control everyone. Everyone has to do what you tell them to do, and they have no options about it, right? If I own all of the land, I'm in charge, right? And I can set the prices as much as I want. So to suggest that it's a voluntary trade when I control all of the natural resources, when I'm the only one with water access, and I tell you, pay me $1,000 for a gallon of water, right? You're going to pay $1,000 for a gallon of water because that's the only way you're going to survive. And the exact same thing is true about land. The exact same thing is true about any number of natural resources. And so to decide to allow the control of that just because it's no longer feudal Europe is insane. So let's listen to why he argues that is not insane, because I think it's important to get his perspective.
Proper to call different things by different names. If we keep the name property for the former, we must call the latter robbery, rapine, brigandine. If, on the contrary, we reserve the name property for the latter, we must designate the former by the term possession, or some other equivalent. Otherwise we should be troubled with an odious synonymy. What makes Slime's citing of Proudhon extra amusing is the fact that Slime is in favour of direct democracy, and when Proudhon defined anarchy, he defined it as being opposed to democracy. Neither hereditary nor election, nor universal suffrage, nor the excellence of the sovereign, nor the consecration of religion and of time, can make royalty legitimate. Whatever form it takes, monarchistic, oligarchic, or democratic, royalty, or the government of man by man, is illegitimate and absurd.
I muted myself and that was foolish. Okay, so this part is interesting. He's suggesting that when Proudhon is saying that, what he's actually saying is that democratic systems, right, are still going to have control, right? So in his perfect world, and this is the idealized state, in a perfect anarchist state, it is true that there would not be rulers, and included in rulers are democratic rulers, right? But the question is, how do we get to a place that is closer to a place without rulers, right? Is the way that we get closer to a place without rulers by allowing one person to control all of the natural resources, one person to control all of the land, one person to control all of the water, or is it to have people in general, right, society in general, have that control in the short term, while trying to get to a point where we have an abundance, and therefore, because we have an abundance, there's no need to be constantly competing about it, right? It's good that we compete over labor, right? I want to be competing in terms of labor. That's a good thing. But when we're competing over natural resources, that means that by definition, we're limiting our ability to achieve our goal sets, whatever those goal sets might be, because of the lack of natural resources. And so it is true that in order to get to a strictly perfect anarchistic system, we would have to have an abundance of natural resources, all natural resources. We would have to have an abundance of water. We'd have to have an abundance of air, clean air, to clarify. We'd have to have an abundance of land. All of this would be necessary to have a functioning system in that context. But in the meantime, the question is, given that we don't have an abundance of natural resources, how should we best allocate those? And my answer is that we should be allocating them in a way that is broadly democratic in the context of natural resources. Now, that's very different than in the context of labor. Labor should be yours, and it should be exclusively yours, and no one should be telling you how to do your labor, and no one should be taking value from your labor. That means that labor taxes are extraordinarily unacceptable.
Before I get to Slime's horrific self-contradictions, I would ask that you hit the like button if you want to see more anarchist content from an economically literate perspective. So, in his anarchism Q&A, Slime says that anarchists oppose hierarchy, authority, and oppression, and later goes on to say that authority is only rejected where it does not prove itself to be necessary or beneficial. So ignoring the obvious contradiction there, he begs the question of how to know whether it's beneficial. Do we ask the authority, the people it rules, some third party? This is not made clear. He does add to this point later, saying that whatever authority exists should be mutually consensual and revocable at any time, which might as well have been written in the Ethics of Liberty. AnCaps do not dispute this. At this point I run into an issue of what his actual position on hierarchy is. In his AnCaps Aren't Real Anarchists video, he says that he's opposed to unjust hierarchy, but then debunks AnCapism by pointing out that owning things and selling labour are hierarchies, but he doesn't show them to be unjust hierarchies. But if I assume he is against
Yeah, so the reason that they're unjust hierarchies is because you don't have the ability to say no to them, right? What makes an unjust hierarchy is the lack of a capacity to say no. So it's unjust if for example, I'm trying to think of an example that's outside of the context of natural resources. Let's say that I am let's say I'm a slave. That's a good example. If I'm a slave, I'm not able to say no, right? And because I'm a slave, and because I'm not able to say no, that makes it unjust. The reason that it's unjust to have slaves is primarily, like the primary driver of it is because slaves can't say no, right? And that is what makes it wrong, right? And so that's the lack of justice there. And similarly, in the concept of natural resources, if you control all of the land, in essence, you're creating slaves, right? Serfs are, in broad terms, approximating the equivalent state of a slave because they too are not able to say no. And if you're not able to say no, that means that your yes is not a real yes.
hierarchy.
So there's no need to have like some overarching system other than can you say no, right? And if you can't say no, then it's unjust.
A hierarchy, and not only unjust hierarchy, then I am forced to ponder how exactly he thinks he can enforce that no hierarchies form without coercing anyone. After all, there are hierarchies present in any valued pursuit. Slime is higher in the YouTube hierarchy than me, Usain Bolt is higher in the running hierarchy than Slime, and Shroud is higher on the CSGO hierarchy than Bolt. Nowhere in these differences of dominance is it implied that anyone is coerced or ruled. And in case you are not yet convinced that Slime is yet to read a single piece of AnCap literature, or even talk to an AnCap, he erroneously states that the NAP is fine with slavery, and I have absolutely no idea where he could have conjured that from. What's more is he sets up a dichotomy between leftist anarchists and AnCaps on why they want the state gone, saying the leftists want it gone as it is a hierarchy that does not meet the burden of proof necessary to justify its existence. And assuming that burden is consent, then AnCaps wholeheartedly agree with this. Slime instead says that AnCaps want the state gone because it interferes with the market, showing an utter lack of knowledge of what the market is. The market is not some nebulous entity that one can infringe on in a vacuum. The market is just us. It's people interacting. To infringe on the market is to infringe on individuals. To top off his economic...
Yeah, so the rest of this is going to be stuff that I agree with, but I just wish that he would grapple more than he did with this problem of natural resources, because the reality is that is the problem with AnCap sort of ideology, because they just don't recognize the fact that there is a difference between labor and natural resources, right? I worked to create the labor that I do, right? But my labor doesn't exist in a vacuum. My labor is a mixture of the labor that I'm putting in and the stuff that I'm laboring upon from a physical perspective, and ultimately everything can be zoomed back to a physical perspective, right? When we're talking about the value, like why is it valuable? I guess I'll use this, what I'm doing now, if that's valuable, although not really because I don't get paid. But like, let's pretend hypothetically that I were very super famous and very super successful as a YouTuber. Well, let's break down like why that's valuable. Well, that's valuable because people are giving me money. And we can zoom back to ask, why do they have money? They have money because they're doing something physical, right? Let's think about like why is it valuable to have an advertisement on it? Even if they're not giving me money, there might be advertisements on the video. Well, why is an advertisement valuable? An advertisement is valuable because people are going to be buying physical things. If you zoom back, and it goes beyond that, right? Like, how are you literally watching me right now? You're watching me on a computer, you're watching me on a phone, you're watching me on a physical device, right? How are you able to have access to the Wi-Fi? We're able to have access to the Wi-Fi because of physical cables that connect, right? Like, all of this is like, ultimately, if you winnow it down, it all comes down to this phone, right? That computer, all of this, the camera that you're looking at me through, all of this is physical. All of this is a mixture of the labor that someone put in, the intellectual labor behind this computer, the physical labor behind getting the minerals in order to create the computer, all of the labor that went into this, all of the thousands of people that were involved in creating this device, that were involved in creating that camera, all of that, right? That is labor, and that is the driver of all labor mixing, right? So the mixture of labor is becoming ever more complex, but it doesn't actually change the underlying premise of what labor is. It doesn't change the underlying fact that labor is a mixture between natural resources and the work of individuals.